going back to the city, what about renting some of the, on Airbnb, you could also rent a room. Mm-hmm. How does that work? We haven't talked about that at all. We've been talking about renting units. How does that work in, I want to rent a room out in, I'm going to split. I have a condo. I want to split the rooms 3 ways and get 3 different licenses and do it that way.
So you can, it's a shared housing unit where you can rent just part of your unit. You do have to get a license as well for that. This is going back to the time when it was a boarding house or a rooming house. So very, very similar thought process went into the ordinance, so that you do need a license. It will be different if you're living there and having roommates versus you are just renting by the room. If it's the latter, where you're not living there and you're renting by the room, you definitely need a license. Otherwise, it's more of a roommate situation. And as long as, I should say this, so if you're living there and you have a roommate who's going to live there and contribute to rent, you are not under the shared housing ordinance. You do not have to worry about a license. If you are living there and you are having shared housing people coming, on Craigslist and living with you for 2 months and then moving out, you would actually be considered shared housing. I had a case that was just like that, where there was a unit owner at one of the associations, and the association had a ban on shared housing, and he considered these people to be his roommates, but they were only living there for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks. He was finding them online through Craigslist. And when we finally went to court, the court ruled, and this is just the trial court, it didn't go up to the Supreme Court or anything like that, but the judge did rule that that would be considered shared housing because it was a business transaction versus, like a long-term roommate situation. So.
Got it. Man, there's a lot to chew on here.
There is a lot to chew on. There really is a lot to chew on. But it's good that we have at least some regulations. Some are in favor of building owners, some are not. But at least there's some clear guidelines that our building owners can follow now that this ordinance has been in place for a few years and been getting enforced. So you know what to do and what not to do.
What about long-term landlords? I hear long-term landlords they will rent to somebody with intentions of thinking that they're going to be moving in, and they try to run a short-term business in their unit. What rights does a long-term landlord have to get those people out? Is it just enforce the lease, or I imagine you come across these scenarios?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. I have 10-day notices, evictions for cause based on short-term rentals and Airbnb all the time, constantly passing my desk. So really, it will depend on the lease. So if there's a specific and explicit ban on short-term rentals in the lease, the landlord can enforce it against the tenant. The other thing that landlords should keep in mind is even though the Chicago RLTO requires a landlord to accept a reasonable sublet, you have to think about what's reasonable. Is a 3-day sublet under Airbnb reasonable? No. I always tell clients if it's under the vacation rental of 32 days, it is probably not reasonable. That's not what's contemplated by the RLTO. The other thing to think about is a lease often says that the tenant cannot break the law, cannot violate any local ordinance. If that tenant is renting on Airbnb, my guess is that tenant is not licensed through the city of Chicago for short-term rentals. And by listing it on Airbnb without a license, they're in violation of municipal code and therefore in violation of the lease as well. So even if your lease does not explicitly say you cannot rent under Airbnb, there are a lot of different reasons that the landlord or basis, I guess, for the landlord to bring an eviction or a violation against that tenant to stop the Airbnb rentals. Because that's a no-no. No landlord wants to think that they've got a 12-month lease with Joe Smith, and then Joe Smith starts bringing in different people every weekend, and he doesn't even live there. You got to put an end to that real quickly.